Okay, lesson 1. All right, so lesson 1 is the history of Israel up to this point. And, that was book 1 we went through. So, I don't know, was there anything surprising in there that y'all read? Oh yeah, we read that. I remember that. Oh yeah, we remember that.
Yeah, that was a nice summary.
Yeah, it's kind of like, man, this should have been a study guide for the intern.
Right.
So, notes that I took, even after God destroyed the world by flood, the world became evil again. At Babel, God confused the languages. God chose Abraham from among these wicked men, gave him 3 promises, which we talked about earlier. I'll make your people a great nation, give you the land of Canaan, and through your seed all of the earth will be blessed. Later in his life, God gave Abraham the son of promise named Isaac. And to Isaac were born twins, Esau and Jacob. Who was the oldest? Esau. But they're twins, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Esau came out first. And they fought in the womb. Through the line of Jacob, the Abrahamic blessings were fulfilled. Jacob had 12 sons and 1 daughter. What was the daughter's name? Y'all remember? Dinah. I could have asked you what was the 12 sons' name. Over time, God changed Jacob's name to Israel, and his sons each grew large families. These eventually came to be known as the 12 tribes of Israel. In Jacob's older years, the 10 older brothers sold their brother Joseph into slavery. God was with Joseph and caused him to rise in power in Egypt, and eventually he became second in command. And after a great famine came, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt looking for grain. And my notes just jumped way off. After Joseph died, a new dynasty came to power and decided to enslave the Israelites. And during the time of their slavery, the Israelites greatly multiplied, as God told Abraham they would. Moses was born near the end of the period of slavery, and God had sent him to lead Israel out of Egyptian bondage. After the 10 plagues had been sent to Egypt, Pharaoh let them go, but later changed his mind. God delivered Israel from Pharaoh and his army by leading them across the Red Sea on dry ground and then drowning the Egyptian army in it. Gotta correct my notes here. Drawing, but it's supposed to be drowning. Drowning them in the Red Sea. While they wandered in the wilderness, God gave them the law through Moses. And this law included the 10 Commandments, all ceremonial laws, and instructions for worship and building the temple. And Israel ended up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Everyone over the age of 20, except Joshua and Caleb, died during the wilderness because of their unfaithfulness to God. God told Moses to appoint Joshua to lead after his death, and after Moses died, Joshua led Israel in the conquest of Canaan. This conquest began with Jericho. The defeat went to the defeat of the southern lands and then the northern lands. And although Israel defeated the Canaanites, they didn't obey God's command to completely drive out the inhabitants. Another typo here. After the land was divided, the Israelites became content to dwell with the remaining Canaanites. It was just easier to let them stay than to fight them out. What's that? Cheaper to kill. Many Israelites practiced the idolatry of the Canaanites and became apostate from the covenant with Jehovah. Now, I kind of copied that phrase out of the lesson. What does that mean? Became apostate from the covenant with Jehovah. Yeah, turned away, and so apostate, and then the covenant, that was an agreement, more than a contract, but an agreement that they had with God. Alright, so when Israel did this, the nations around them were able to oppress and defeat them. And so when Israel became subject to an oppressor nation, they would call out to God for deliverance, and God raised up judges to bring that deliverance. And over a period of about 400 years, now I don't know if y'all noticed that. Did you notice the 400 years here? Because in the book 1, they said about 300 years. So my guess is it's somewhere between 300 and 400, and I didn't go do the math. But in book 1, it said 300 years, about 300 years. And here it said about 400 years. So, but anyway, it says, over a period of about 400 years, 15 judges were used by God to deliver Israel. Eventually, Israel became discontent with the judges and requested a king. We want to be like everybody else. God allowed them to appoint a king, and Saul became the first king of Israel. And when Saul repeatedly disobeyed God, David was appointed to replace him. God helped David to completely defeat his enemies. Solomon was blessed with a time of prosperity and conducted a huge building campaign which included the temple. The building campaign heavily taxed the people, and by the time his reign was over, the people were ready to rebel. But they didn't rebel against Solomon. Jeroboam led 10 tribes away from allegiance to the Davidic kings and formed another nation. The 10 tribes were called Israel. The remaining 2 tribes were called Judah and were ruled by Solomon's son Rehoboam. The civil war in Israel allowed their neighboring nations who were defeated by David to grow in strength. Because of their wickedness, Israel was destroyed as a nation and taken into Assyrian captivity in 722 BC. Judah's kings were generally more righteous, but by 586 BC, Judah had become so wicked she was taken into Babylonian captivity for 70 years. The next session begins with the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, notice that Judah's captivity had an end, right? 70 years, and then they came back. When did Israel's captivity end? How long were they in captivity? It don't talk about it, right?
No.
So the Babylonians took over everybody, so you got to imagine that the Israelites who were captured by the Assyrians and taken to Persia, then Babylon rises up, conquers everybody, so now they're part of the Babylonian captivity, but now they've been captive for a long time, because they were captive before Babylon came and took Judah. So my guess is, and I've never looked that up myself, but my guess is that a lot of those, either became, part of the culture there, or they were part of the 42,000 that came back with Nehemiah, that kind of thing. Because, God's not going to forsake them. He promised He never would, But I thought it was interesting. I don't remember any prophecy where the prophet said, Israel, you're going to be taken captive, but after this many years, you get to come back. But for Judah, it said, you're going to be taken captive for 70 years, and then you'll come back. Interesting point. Thoughts, comments on the first lesson?
I bet there was dude that was 39 years old was sweating.
What's this gonna happen?
Oh, Lord. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think I remember when I was reading, I underlined, the 10 tribes were called Israel, and I put a question mark, but it goes back to what you were saying, you have to know the time, because it can be very confusing.
Mm-hmm. So the 10 tribes, I can see, they're probably, because when they split, there was a civil war. And I imagine part of that civil war is who's going to get to keep the name Israel? Because Israel was their patriarch father, right? They were all children of Israel. And so, because there were 10 tribes, they were like, no, we're keeping the name Israel. I don't care what name y'all got, but we're going to be Israel. And Judah was like, fine, we'll just be Judah then. Which poor little Benjamin was like, well, I guess I'm just going to be Benjamin. I'm just going to be Judah, little Judah. All right. Lesson 2, or 15 in our series. Book of Ezra. All right, when God sent, and if y'all have a question or a comment or something, just, kind of stop me along the way, and I'll try to catch a breath or whatever. But we only got about 9 minutes before the break. So, when God sent Israel into Babylonian captivity in 586, his prophets foretold it would last 70 years. Jeremiah 25:12. According to God's word, Cyrus, the king of Persia, defeated the Babylonians in 539 BC, and soon after, he issued a decree allowing the exiled people to return to their homeland. Cyrus also allowed these people to rebuild their place of worship, which meant Israel could rebuild the temple. Zerubbabel and Jeshua led a group of 42,360 Jews from Babylon to Jerusalem in about 536 BC.
516.
536.
16.
You got 516.
Oh, did I just write it down? Again, I'm doing these notes and it's late and I'm really tired, so maybe I wrote it down wrong.
No pressure, no pressure.
Yeah, therefore, in the second paragraph, Zerubbabel and Jeshua led 42,000 Jews from Babylon to Jerusalem in about 536 BC.
Our book got 516.
Are you serious?
What's your book at? Does it?
Does it work?
Check it
Wow.
out. That is weird.
Yeah, we need to call and let them know.
So let's think about it. Which one makes sense?
Wow.
I think 536 is going to make sense because 515 was the date of the temple being rebuilt. So 536, you know, you
Yeah,
do 12 years of Nehemiah's first visit, that would get you to 524. And so then it's only 9 years more to get to the finishing of the temple. So that's probably, 536 is probably correct. Well, I apologize for that. We didn't know you had different books. That's another trick, right? All right. Let's see. Where did we get here? Comparatively, only a small number of the captives returned to Judah of what was taken captive. 42,000. Think about how many there were to begin with. When they began to go home, Cyrus gave the temple vessels which Nebuchadnezzar had taken. Gave them that, which was cool. When they returned, the exiles built an altar and offered worship to God. They observed the Feast of Tabernacles, and they began rebuilding the temple. When the foundation was completed, this is an interesting story and worth note. Part of the people shouted praise to God, but others wept because they compared the small foundations to the temple that Solomon had built. So there were people, like you said, those people that were 39 years old. Anybody that was, they may have been young children, but they could remember the magnificence of Solomon's temple. I mean, this thing shined. Because it was covered in gold, right? So anywhere you were, if the sun was hitting it, it was going to be glinting, and it was huge. I don't remember the height. I want to think it was like 50 feet high or something. It was huge. And then they're rebuilding, but they don't have near the resources that Solomon had. They don't have the money, they don't have the workers, so they had to scale it way down. And so some of them are praising God because they're young enough that they don't even remember the old temple. And to them, it's an impressive thing. Boy, this is awesome. Look at this. But then those old, the gray heads that could remember, they're like, yeah, this is great, but it sure ain't Solomon's temple. So that kind of makes you think about, everybody but Shalisha, we're all getting old enough. We can remember back, when, the old days. We remember when the gray heads was running the show and they was having church, and we may or may not have understood it at the time, but you knew they was having church. And then now it's like we'll have church and everybody's like, whoa, that was awesome. And you go, yeah, that was great. That was great, but I remember back in the day, and it really shouldn't be that way, right? because we're not looking for physical things. We don't need gold and silver to build something
Right.
here. We just need our hearts turned to God, which is what they did. I mean, because a
Yeah.
lot of times those old timers ahead of us, they didn't have nothing, but they knew how to worship. Like we talked earlier, hard times will bend the knee. They was all the time seeking God, and God was blessing, so be a lesson for us.
I looked that up. It's between 520 and 538, so somewhere between there. So,
Gotcha.
36 is good.
All right, well, it's 6:56. We'll go a little bit further, and then we'll go ahead and break. When the people who later became known as the Samaritans heard the exiles were rebuilding the temple, they offered to help. Now, you'd think that'd be a good thing, right? The Samaritans were composed of people imported by the Assyrians and the captives that intermarried with them. Their moral and spiritual degeneracy is described in 2 Kings 17. So that would be why that Nehemiah didn't allow them to help with the rebuilding. We don't want our most holy place, where we want the presence of God to come and dwell, to be even touched by people who have chosen to break God's laws. I mean, you just went out and just chose to do it. You're living a life in defiance of God because you've married these strange people. So they kind of had to draw a line. What's that?
No, I think I read it wrong, but yeah, I didn't make sense what you're saying now.
So when Zerubbabel and I love all these names, right? Zerubbabel and Jeshua refused their help, the Samaritans worked against them to stop the rebuilding of the temple. Well, if we can't be part of it, y'all can't even have it. Counselors were sent to the courts of Persia to frustrate the plans of the people of Judah. Tattletales. And the Samaritans later wrote letters that stopped the rebuilding of the city wall of Jerusalem under Ahasuerus or Xerxes and Artaxerxes. For over 10 years, work on the temple was halted. Finally, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah were able to stir Israel to finish the rebuilding of the temple. And when the work resumed, the Persian governor Tatanai, sounds like a Star Wars name, requested whether the work was authorized and asked that a search be done to reveal whether it was. And in the search, they found the decree by King Cyrus many years before. So the temple was completed, and partly using Persian funds. So the king had committed money to help them rebuild. A great celebration marked the conclusion of the temple build, and they kept the Passover for the first time since the captivity. Nearly 60 years after they were allowed to return under King Cyrus, Ezra led a second group from Babylon to Jerusalem in about 458 BC. Ezra was a priest and a scribe. That means he was a teacher, an interpreter, and a copier of the Mosaical law. They didn't have printing machines back then. And he had risen to a high position under the Persian king Artaxerxes, who reigned from 465 to 424. In Artaxerxes' 7th year as king, Ezra was commissioned to go to Jerusalem and inquire about it for the king and to offer sacrifice on his behalf. So, hey, go check it out. Tell me what's going on. But here, go ahead and offer up a sacrifice for me while you're there. The king had sent money to Ezra, or with Ezra, to use on his behalf in sacrificing and for whatever else Ezra needed. And about 1,500 exiles went with Ezra, which included 240 Levites for the temple service. All right. One more sentence and we'll finish this page and then we'll take our break. On the way to Jerusalem, Ezra divided the money that came from the king among 12 different men who gave the money to the temple officials on the 4th day after they returned to Jerusalem. I don't know why that note was in there, and I don't remember reading that in the Bible, but I'm sure it's in there, but found that interesting, But it's smart. I mean, if you have all the money in one spot, you have some band of robbers come and take it all, but if it's distributed a bunch of people, then maybe some of it would be saved.
A little note there, the little note over there says 536 as well.
Those 100 that came back with Ezra, and on the way he split up the money that the king had given him among 12 different men. So when Ezra gets back, It says the princes of Israel reported to Ezra that the people had intermarried with the Canaanite nations, and this included people who ministered in the temple. Now, this is the same accusation that Nehemiah dealt with years before. You know, what's like 60 some odd years before. Now here they are doing it again. Alright, so when Ezra heard this, it really upset him. It says he rent his clothes, pulled out some of his beard and hair of his head, and then he sat down just appalled. I can't even believe this. But it says he sat there all day till the evening, until a large crowd gathered. And then Ezra stood up and prayed publicly to Jehovah God. And in that prayer, it says he confessed Israel's sins are what caused their captivity, and that only God's mercy had allowed them to return to Judah, and that Israel had once again forsaken God's commandments. It was your sin that got you captured in the first place. But his faithfulness saved you and brought you back. But what did you do? You just went back and did the same old thing that you did before. So the people were moved to tears. And then here's this one guy, Shechaniah, one of the exiles that was involved in a mixed marriage, suggested that the Israelites put away or divorce their foreign women. So some might say, well, maybe he was tired of his. It doesn't really give a reason. Maybe he was moved spiritually, that this is the right thing to do. I don't know, but it's almost kind of convenient that he was one of them that was doing it, and he made the suggestion. Let's put away our wives. Let's get rid of our wives. We can get new ones, right? All right. So the people agreed. And then a proclamation was sent throughout Judah demanding that every Jew assemble in Jerusalem on the third day. And when they assembled, Ezra publicly charged the exiles with sin in doing this, which they did acknowledge. And the officers were appointed over the city to be sure that the foreign wives were put away. And within 10 days, this was done, and it included even those women who had borne children. So it says, in this way, Ezra saved Israel from immediate spiritual corruption. So we go back to Nehemiah, and we go back to Solomon, and you say, well, that just sounds awful harsh, awful cruel, that they would do this. And in a sense it is, but if they had not done it, then they have foreign women who worship foreign gods, who are going to just lead them right back into idolatry, which is what caused all this in the first place, right? So Ezra said, look, it's like a cancer. We have to cut it out, get it out of the body so that we can heal and recover. And the only way you can't just stave it off and say, okay, cancer, you can live in the body, but you can't go out beyond this border. Cancer ain't going to do that. Cancer is going to grow. And so if you don't get it out of the body, it's just going to take over. So it's a hard thing, and like the version you were reading, the NIV, it says, and I beat them and pulled out their hair, and so it was a serious deal. I mean, it was. But if we think back to the law, and what was the punishment for breaking the law most of the time? Death. You either be, just summarily executed, or you'd be stoned to death, or whatever. But here, instead of killing them, it said, okay, the punishment is you got to put away the evil thing. Get rid of the foreign spouses. Get them away, because they're going to be your downfall. All right, questions, comments? That ends lesson 2. Look at that, we blazing through here. 12 minutes.
You can
Lesson 3, book of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah was the cupbearer for Artaxerxes the First. I actually wrote it down right here. The Persian king from 464 to 424. In his 20th year, Nehemiah's brother Hanani, who had recently returned to Jerusalem, reported that the wall of the city was broken down and that the people were in distress. And for 4 months, this weighed heavily on Nehemiah, and he became depressed and sad. Now, you know, you think, well, big deal. It's, you know, stuff's not being kept up like it was. But, I mean, he had poured everything he had into it, right? So the king noticed his sadness and asked about it. And Nehemiah told the king about the situation. Man, my spelling is horrible. I was typing this up last night. Situation in Jerusalem, and requested to go to rebuild the walls. And Artaxerxes granted his request. After Nehemiah had been in Jerusalem for 3 days, he went out and surveyed the walls at night. Now, I found that interesting when you're actually reading in the scripture, you know, that it was almost like a secret mission, you know, that Nehemiah got up in the middle of the night to go check out the walls. And why would he do that, you know? But as we've already talked about, there were a bunch of enemies, spies, people trying to undermine everything. And so, you know, Nehemiah just, okay, I need to do this inspection. I don't need any help. I don't need enemies trying to deceive me with things or, you know, hide things from me. And so he just went around and picked a time when he could kind of have privacy, I guess, in doing it. But it ended up he was doing it in the middle of the night. And you kind of think, well, you know, probably couldn't see very good, but anyway, he did that in the middle of the night. But the next day, he called on the people to help rebuild the walls, and assignments were made for each family to restore a certain section. Sanballat and Tobiah, men from neighboring nations, did all they could to stop the work. Now, what do y'all think about that, assigning the families to different sections? Good thing, bad thing?
I think it's a good thing in regards to, like, I think we do it all the time, honestly. Like, even like, okay, so for like what you and Shalisa do here,
Right.
what Pam and I do there, you know. So it's I think it's a good thing. Generally, you work better with family.
Yeah.
I mean, generally.
You know how to tolerate it.
Yes. But I think it's a good thing.
I mean, it's probably trying to get buy-in too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you know, family tends to already be a team,
Right.
and then you're trying to rebuild the wall, and you want to rebuild it quick.
Right.
So, well, the Joneses, man, they already got 3 levels high. Man, we got to get to moving, you know. So it probably generated some competition among the different families. Our part of the wall will be the prettiest. Our part of the wall will be the strongest, you know, that kind of stuff. But like you said, it also probably really hinged on the fact that they were family, so they were looking out for one another and you know, just really pushing one another, that kind of thing. I thought it was kind of interesting, you know, because you could also see a downside that, well, why do the Russells get to build that part of the wall? That's my favorite part. We're all the way on the other side, you know. So I can imagine there was some negative stuff like that, but in the end, everybody kind of got with the program and they all worked together. So to demoralize the people, Tobiah said, when they build it, even the fox, if it goes up on it, he'll break down their stone wall. That's in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 3. When that didn't work, Sanballat and Tobiah organized the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites to fight Jerusalem. To overcome the attacks, the soldiers were stationed by the workers. And some of them even worked with one hand while they carried a spear in the other hand, because they never knew when an attack would be coming. The work continued because the people had a mind to work. One of the famous phrases from the Bible. People had a mind to work. During the reconstruction, a famine occurred. And to survive, the people had to mortgage their property to pay, to get food. And they had to still pay the king's taxes, so they had to borrow even more money. Man, that sounds a little bit like today, don't it? And many of them even had to sell themselves into slavery just to survive. And so Nehemiah, seeing this, he rebuked the nobles and charged them, you know, for having such high interest rates and causing their brethren to go right back into slavery, since they had just come out of Babylon. And those that were rich decided to return the land, and they released the indebtedness of the poor so that the work on the walls was able to continue. And after only 52 days, the walls were completed. So think about the Wailing Wall. That's the most famous wall in Jerusalem now, right? The Wailing Wall. Have y'all seen it? Has anybody ever been there? I haven't either. But you see that wall, and you'll see pictures on TV and on movies and whatnot. And I mean, you see these people down at the bottom of the wall praying, and that wall is, how tall is that? 40 feet or something?
Yeah, it's really tall, bro.
And they built this thing in 52 days. All the way around the city. 52 days, all the way around the city. That's just impressive, isn't it? But it says, because the people had a mind to work. It kind of makes you think back to Babel. We're going to build a tower all the way up to God. And God said, well, let's go ahead and mess their language up unless they're able to do what they set out to do. Now, there ain't no way they could build a tower up to God, but apparently God felt like that they could achieve way more than they had any business doing. And so he told them, hey, look, I didn't mean for y'all to all gather together here in one spot. I meant for you to go and replenish the earth and cover the earth. All right, so Nehemiah was appointed governor of Judah and served from 444 to 432. During his term, he collected no taxes from the people to support his administration, even though he had 150 men who ate from his table. All that expense was covered by Nehemiah himself. Several attempts were made on Nehemiah's life during this period as a result of the efforts of Sanballat and Tobiah. But they got a reward when their life was over. During Nehemiah's reign as governor, the people were called to an assembly at the Watergate. A podium was set up, and Ezra the scribe read to the people from the law of Moses. And he read this from early morning until midday. That's a lot of reading. Dearly beloved, we're gathered here today 6 hours later. While hearing God's law, the people began to weep. So, I mean, just think about the significance of that. That some of these people, they didn't have much of a relationship with God because they had intermarried with, the strange people. And, I mean, now some of them had come back, with Nehemiah, so some of them were, but they had been in captivity, And so here they are, and they're reading this book of the law, but I guess it was not something that they'd heard very often. And it moved them to begin to weep, so there was significance to it, and it just speaks to how the Word of God is powerful. It's alive. And even in their kind of backslidden, if you will, condition, the Word of God was able to break them down. So Nehemiah stopped the reading, and he ordered the people to go home and to feast, because this was a day of rejoicing and not a day of weeping. They were rejoicing because they had finished building the wall. So the people assembled again the next day to hear more of the law. Mom, we got to go back over there again? But they came back for more. And when the commandments were read, and the Feast of the Tabernacles in the 7th month, and it was the 7th month, the assembly decided, hey, let's go home and keep the 7-day Feast of Tabernacles. And after that feast, the people assembled again. The history of Abraham was rehearsed to them by the Levites. And after this, all of Israel covenanted together to keep God's commandments. And since the city was so sparsely populated, a plan was made to have 1/10 of all of Judah move into the city. So, I mean, think about how many people live around Huntsville. So what is it? 300,000, 400,000 people, I guess. But we're going to have 1/10 of those move back into the city. All of a sudden you got this influx. But in this case, there wasn't nobody living in the city. It was just a handful of people living. But they'd say, hey, 1 out of 10 of you coming back to live in the city. And that was a plan because they needed the city to be populated. Since Nehemiah's leave of absence was up, he had to return back to Susa, the capital of Persia. And after some time, he returned to Jerusalem again and found the conditions unfavorable. To show how bad things had gotten, Tobiah was even living in one of the store chambers in the court of the temple. Now you're an enemy of these people. Now you got a little condo up in the temple. Nehemiah kicked him out and began several other significant changes. And since the Levites weren't being supported from the temple treasury as they were supposed to, they were forced to work in the fields to support themselves and their families, obviously. So the work of the temple was being neglected. So to combat that, Nehemiah appointed men to be sure that every man paid his tithes in order to support the priests and the Levites, which is the way God set it up. Since buying and selling were being done on the Sabbath day, Nehemiah shut the gates and forbade merchandising and even threatened anyone who disobeyed this with force. Several of the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and Nehemiah charged everyone to stop giving their sons and daughters to foreigners. He used Solomon as an example, as we read earlier, and Nehemiah showed the detrimental influence of foreign women causing their husbands to sin. One of the high priest's sons had even married the daughter of Sanballat, and Nehemiah kicked him out. And through these reforms, Nehemiah purified the religion of those who returned from Babylonian captivity. Cool. Questions, comments? Look at that, 7:30 on the dot. Man, we couldn't have timed it any better.
Thank you.
Good deal, good deal. All right, so
Good stuff, good stuff.
4, 5, and 6 next week.
4, 5, and 6.
Yeah, so we got to go 3 lessons for a few weeks here, and then it backs off to 2. So, whereas last time it was heavy on the back end, this time it's heavy on the front end. So, this week and 2 more weeks, then we have our break. After we come back from Thanksgiving, then we just have 2 lessons and 2 lessons, and then the final.
4 lessons. 4 lessons. They sure, yeah, we get our study in there. If we slide 4 lessons, because we done today at 7:30. 4 lessons there somewhere.
Plotting and scheming down there. Right?
Yeah, trying to get me a study session in somewhere.
Yeah, maybe we can. I've been trying to put some thought into that. Maybe doing the final a little different. But we still got a minute before we get there. So
Yeah.
All right, y'all.
I
Thanks
think
for understanding.
I think you did
Good night.
good on the final, man. It's just, like I said, so much info that you gotta cram in.
oh yeah.
I know it's tough on y'all, it's tough on my. Alright.
I'll be good to take care of it.
Oh, my hat.
Gonna need that.